This is the fourth and final lecture looking at the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962, and here we're looking at the end game, how the war ends, and we pick up with looking at why France would even want to leave Algeria. France has been in Algeria since 1830, and at this point 1.2 million colons or settlers are living in Algeria. These are not just French. They're not just French ethno-linguistically. They are also of Italian, Maltese extraction as well, in other states. But it's France that is the colonial power, and the majority of colons are ethnically French, and French is the language of culture. So why give up something that is an integral part of France? This would be like if the United States decides to give up California or Alaska or Hawaii. Why would France be motivated to do such a radical step? The first simply is expense. It has become very expensive for France to maintain its colony. The second is soldier fatigue. The French military is, by the mid-50s, 10 years out from fighting in World War II. Senior military officers fought in the Second World War and are exhausted. And we see a lessening amount of new recruits. There's also domestic opposition to maintaining the colony in France. We have the international opposition to French colonial rule, as seen through previous lectures, and so this international opposition comes in the form of the United Nations, comes in the form of the non-aligned movement, comes in the form of other bodies and newly independent states such as India. And that brings us to the last point, which is that the world is decolonizing. The old world order is on its way out, and so it's best to leave on good terms. This is a lot like Britain's reasoning for getting out of India. It's like, well, the world of colonial superpowers is not going to be the case in the not too distant future. So let's get ahead of the curve now so these new countries like us. It's worth taking a look at French politics. So the Fourth Republic, the way the French government works is a bit unlike ours in that there are these constitutional structures, these governmental structures, not just a particular individual, a particular president, but the structure of the government. And every time there's a big overhaul, it's known as a new republic. So the Fourth Republic comes in after World War II and lasts until 1958. There's a lot of dysfunction in the Fourth Republic, especially in how France views the notion of decolonization. So throughout the war, it leads to, this really dominates French politics, and a lot of French politicians are weak during the Fourth Republic. They don't want to make decisions. They say, well, we'll let the generals decide, and as a result, there's not a coherent French structure from the top. What we also see is this lack of decisiveness by French politicians leads to, or maybe is caused by, French public being split on what to do in Algeria. Should they escalate and crush the FLN and win the peace, or is France the new Nazis, as I write here? There is real disgust with what the French military is doing in Algeria, and this is 10 years after Nazi occupation, so this is certainly in the lived memory of the French public. So there's a real disgust with this. There's a Le Monde, a major French newspaper, Le Monde, a journalist, Jean Lacouture, I think I'm saying his name wrong, Lacouture. He later admits France won militarily, but lost politically. And that's because the methods of victory turned international opinion against the French cause. And so what this leads to is the collapse of the Fourth Republic, as you see there at the top. And the hero of Free France in World War II is this fellow here, Charles de Gaulle. You perhaps know his name. He's very, very well known in France. The airport in Paris is named after him. He's a big deal. He's the hero of France during World War II, and he is brought back in 1958 with a new constitution that gives the president more power. And that's part of the notion here is let's bring back in, the Hall of Famer. Let's give him a lot of power. And the colons and the army are both calling for de Gaulle to come in, because both the colons and the army want to keep Algeria French. The army has put a lot of effort into keeping Algeria French, and the wavering that comes about through the French public is seen by members of the military as disrespectful to their service. So de Gaulle takes over France in June of 58 with the idea that he's going to be decisive. The general perspective is that he will crush the FLN. So we're going to pivot now from French politics briefly to looking at Algerian politics. You remember this fellow here. This is Ferhat Abbas. He was the assimilationist of the 1930s. His political views evolved from pro-French collaboration, as you remember from the Blum-Violet proposal, to being a revolutionary nationalist. And this is just over a 20-year period. So he shifts pretty radically, right? He remains throughout opposed to violence, but he does join the FLN in the 50s with the start of the war, and he's appointed as the FLN delegate. Prior to that, he's appointed as the FLN delegate to the United Nations. This newspaper clipping, which is from the New York Times, shows that he is appointed as the president of the Provisional Algerian National Government in exile, based in Cairo. Cairo is sort of the center of the Arab world in terms of music and pop culture and cinema, but it's also the seat of the Arab League, sort of the Arab United Nations, and this government in exile is called by the acronym GPRA. In English, we translate it to the Provisional Government of the Algerian Republic. And it was the international diplomatic wing of the FLN. So it's part of the FLN, but its focus is on international diplomacy. It's on international relations. So the equivalent also then is the ALN, is the National Liberation Army, is the military wing of the FLN. I want you to remember this when we come to looking at independent Algeria. What ends up happening is we have a rivalry that comes about between the Algerian leadership, who is based in Algeria during the war and is backed by the military, versus Ferhat Abbas and the GPRA. So we have the FLN based in Algiers, and then we have the international diplomatic wing of the FLN that's based in Cairo. And when this whole thing is over and Algeria gets its independence, that leads to some problems that you kind of have two governments there. This headline is from September of 58. One other thing about... we'll hold it, sorry. Okay. So Abbas feels like he can work with and goes into attempts to have negotiations with De Gaulle, and de Gaulle ends up switching his position. He switches his position, and like a lot of French people, frankly, he thinks that keeping Algeria by force won't work. That it's not possible to keep Algeria by force. Now, that's not what the army was expecting. That's not what the colons want. But that's what most French people in France think is the case in 1958. So by 1958, we're 4 years into the war, he starts thinking about France's power in the decolonized future. His focus is on French power, French prestige, 5-10 years in the future. So he's not so concerned about maintaining Algeria at any cost, which is what the colons want. This leads to the Constantine Plan in 1958, which is an attempt to sort of be nice with Algeria. It fails. It actually leads to Abbas being recognized as the real government of Algeria by many communist states, all Arab states. So many countries around the world say in 1958, France is not the real ruler of Algeria. This guy is. And that's significant, right? Everybody else is saying you're not really the ruler. He's the ruler. Boy, that's significant. So Charles de Gaulle puts forward 1 year later in 59 3 options. These are the options he puts to Algeria. He says, you can have total secession, that is to say, independence. You can integrate with France and become, all the stuff from the Blum-Violette plan, like from 20 years earlier. Or a degree of self-determination with a continuing alliance. This is sort of like a commonwealth sort of arrangement, unlike the degree which you have with Australia and Canada. They still have the Queen on their money, but they're their own country. He believes that secession would lead to a total breakdown in civil society. And so he is opposed to secession, but he puts it forward as one of the options. Now, this leads to the French military being really angry. The French military thinks, man, we we are out here dying for France, right? Because Algeria is France, and you're giving up on us. These generals, as you see at the top, they're asking for more authority, more power, more troops, more money. And de Gaulle is saying, yeah, if you want to succeed, I don't think it's a good idea, but you can do it. He's looking for diplomatic solutions. These guys are looking for military solutions. So this actually leads to two coup attempts to overthrow French rule. The first one is in January of 60. It's actually by the colons and themselves, not by the generals. And this general here at right, in the top picture, General Charles, he kind of only half-heartedly puts down the coup. Now, a year later, in April of 1961, there's a second coup attempt. And this coup attempt is by the generals themselves. And the coup fails because of what you see in this bottom photo. Charles de Gaulle, he's like old man at this point, right? He puts on his old military uniform from World War II. And in a real understanding of the power of television, he gets in front of the TV and looks at the camera, and he basically tells the rank and file soldiers, I need your help. And remember, he's the hero of World War II, hero of Free France. It's pretty hard to say no to Charles de Gaulle in this context. So this coup fails. But military reaction or violent reaction by the colons is not over. The OAS, the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète. I don't know how to say that correctly, but it's a secret army organization, as it's kind of hilariously called. And this is founded in 60. Now, remember, let's look at the timeline here. Okay, the Battle of Algiers. Well, I guess it was an earlier lecture. The Battle of Algiers is in 56-57 with a French military victory. But there's a political disunity. De Gaulle comes in the next year. Everyone thinks, oh, we're going to get round 2 of the Battle of Algiers, another crushing military victory. Because we can do it, right? We just did it in the Battle of Algiers. We can do it in the mountains. We can do it in the countryside. But de Gaulle flips, and he says, yeah, you can go your own way. So the OAS comes in 60. The OAS is this radical settler military force, and their goal is to keep Algeria French. They want to stop this drift, as they see in the late 50s, towards a move to Algerian independence. Like, Charles de Gaulle, the hero of the war, is not even on our side. It's up to us. It's up to us. This is what the OAS is saying. We can't count on France anymore. We can't count on France to take care of us. We need to take care of us. Now, we can make a connection here to the United States. It's not a perfect connection, but it might help us think about the OAS. Now, not unlike the role of the KKK or the Black Legion or a lot of these white supremacist terrorist organizations, the role that they played, the Klan and the Black Legion played in the United States to maintain white supremacy when blacks and the federal government make moves to extend rights. So Klan 1, the first Klan, comes about in response to Reconstruction. The federal government says, okay, we're going to end slavery, we're going to allow black citizenship, black male voting. The Klan arises and says, hell no, this is a white supremacist state, and none of those things are going to happen. The Klan comes again in the 50s and 60s. In response to the civil rights movement. The federal government can't come down here and tell us how to run our world. The OAS is doing something not dissimilar. They're saying, Paris can't come down here and tell us how to run our country. We're going to scare you into following what we want, giving us what we want. So we're going to threaten Paris, we're going to threaten the Algerian Muslims. So through violence, both organizations seek to hold on to their power. And that's either Cologne white supremacy or American white supremacy. I think that connection is helpful, even though it's, of course, not perfect. The end of the war does come in the early 60s. So France is actually undergoing secret negotiations with the FLN. And a ceasefire is signed in the spring of 62, and the French voters and then the Algerian voters vote to endorse Algerian independence. The Colons still are opposed to this, but what we would consider the Muslim Algerians and the French public in France support Algerian independence, and Algeria does become an independent state July 3rd, 62. So in this time period, in spring of 62, we have the Evian Accords. And the Evian Accords, signed in Evian, France, is basically the peace treaty. And what it calls for is political. Algeria says, we will take care of the colons. We will grant political and economic rights to them. We're not going to chase them out. France agrees to acknowledge Algerian right to rule. It'll withdraw its military force, and this is radically is opposed by the OAS but approved by the voters. The aftermath of this, however, is that the 1.2 million colons leave Algeria after independence, along with the Harki population. The Harki soldiers and their families flee to France, frankly, to refugee camps and then France, but they are treated quite poorly there too. If you're interested more in this story of this refugee crisis, um, in the optional reading, there is a graphic novel that just came out this year that looks at the story of one family who were Harki and were in refugee camps and then came to France. Final slide here. Let's look at some numbers. These numbers are contentious. Why do you think the numbers are contentious? Something to consider. All right, this is going to conclude our look at the Algerian War of Independence from 54 to 62.